Hi, my name is Matt Hartle, and I am presenting to you Memory from Maya 2.0. Some of you may be familiar with the first round of DVDs that I did, and this next offering includes all the information that was on those, plus a bunch more. There's been a lot of advances in Memory over the years, and we get into all of those things, as well as cover a number of production techniques that I use on a daily basis. In this first disc, we'll be covering everything from basic scene setup using the Memory Common tab, to mel scripts, to access custom attributes. We go through memory management, BSP. We talk about some custom shaders on this disc. Much of that is covered on the next DVD that I'm working on. And we also cover motion blur, which is a pretty interesting topic at this point. There's a lot of new things involved in that, as well as depth of field, and that gives us a chance to look at some lens shader stuff. So all in all, I think it's a pretty inclusive DVD, and it should help you get a great start.
All right, so the first thing that we have to do is load the Memory plugin. And to do that, I'm going to go into Windows, Settings and Preferences, Plugin Manager. Inside of the Plugin Manager, you're just looking for the Maya to MR plugin. So I'm going to go on ahead and turn this on and close the window out. Now, you'll notice that nothing has popped up. A dialog popped up telling me that the plugin loaded, but nothing has changed in the interface. And the reason for that is that Memory lives in a couple of different places. One of them is the render globals. That's where most of the access is going to happen. And then also on individual objects, which we'll take a look at in just a second. So as far as the render globals are concerned, you'll notice that there's two tabs here. One of them is common, and the other one is specific to the software renderer that you have selected. And right now it's set to Maya. And if I change it over to Memory, then this second tab will change and fill out with all the Memory options. So inside of Memory tab, now we have all the options that are specific to that renderer. And then common is going to be all the settings that are relevant to the render, no matter what renderer you're using. So if you render with the Maya renderer, you would still be outputting in this resolution, or you would still be rendering from this camera. And we'll talk about some specific setups on that in just a second. The other places that you'll see Memory is loaded are on objects themselves. So if I take a cylinder, for example, and you open up the attribute editor, inside the attribute editor, you've got, of course, the transform and the shape node. Each one of them has options that are specific to Memory. So if I look over in the transform node and you open up the Memory tab, there's the flags that you can get to from here. Or you can go over to the shape node, and there's the Memory tab here, and there's some of the things you can control. Also, if you had like a light, for example, in the scene, that'll also have a Memory tab. Okay, so you can emit photons or shadows, however you want to tweak that. And then also, if you had the hypershade pulled up, any shaders that you create will, of course, have a Memory tab that you can tweak. So if I had a blend shader, for example, in the default, these are all the Maya options, but if you drag down, you'll find a Memory tab, and those will have options specific to Memory. And we'll cover all of this stuff in detail, so I'm just kind of showing you that these attributes exist for the moment. And then, of course, you also have, inside the Hypershade, a Memory nodes tab, and this is where all of the specific Memory shaders reside, whether it's a material shader or a lens shader. Just depends on what you're developing with. So those are the main places you'll find it. And then, of course, there's also a set of menus that are specific to Memory inside of Render Globals under the Memory tab, Approximation Editor being the one that we'll look at extensively. So those are the main ways to access Memory inside of Maya. And the other thing that I like to do is to set up a custom Memory shelf button, and this will be included on the DVD so you can have access to it as well. And basically this just breaks out some of the render stuff, the menus that you'll use a lot as you're using Memory. The first one being the Approximation Editor, which we'll go through in depth. The next one being the default Render Globals button. And basically this just gives you access to some other parts of the scene setup that may not be revealed in the regular render global defaults. And specifically, what I use this for a lot is making sure I have the correct camera selected to render, because a lot of times you might have multiple cameras in the scene, and maybe you can't tell which one is set up to render. The latest versions of Maya have sort of solved this problem by giving you this. I have to reopen it up so it updates, but there ends up being a garbage can thing that shows up, and you can tell it whether or not you want it to render. So like right now I have camera 1 and it's set up to render, and so is perspective, and if I didn't want perspective to render I could turn this off. But short of that, if you're looking for a definitive way to make sure that you're only using a specific camera, then you can open up the default render globals. The rest of these tabs are pretty specific to Maya's renderer, and they're not going to help you out too much in MentalRay. The next tab is the MentalRay render globals. And this one is giving you access to certain things that aren't available in the standard render globals default for MentalRay, such as memory and so forth. For example, you can set a memory limit in here, but you cannot do that inside of the standard globals. So it just kind of reveals some more control, and we'll get into all this in depth as we go through it here. But again, it's a really important one to have access to. And the final one is the MentalRay options. And this is important to you because it helps you to understand what's going on when you render within the scene. For example, it's very important to be able to diagnose how the render is proceeding when you hit the render button. And if you only have warning messages turned on, it's only going to tell you what's happening when you have a problem. And if you want to know that it's opening up a texture, for example, and how long is that taking, you'd have to turn on progress message. So we'll get into that as well. But that's kind of a basic run-through on exactly how MentalRay reveals itself through the interface. Again, all the objects within Maya have MentalRay approximations assigned to them so that you can tweak them out and have them be more specific to the renderer. All right, so the next thing we'll do is talk about how to configure the general tab or the common tab on the render globals. There's a few things in here that I like to do to just simplify your life dramatically, and one of them is the naming of the files, the file name prefix. This blank is a really powerful thing because you can actually tell MentalRay to place files in specific folders in a specific order, and that'll just help you tremendously. So the first thing I'm going to do is tell MentalRay that we're going to be rendering with a name.number.extension, and this is the most commonly used naming convention. So you'll probably have the best luck with it. And as far as image formats are concerned, you can choose whatever you want. I tend to render in SGI for everything but 32-bit stuff, simply because SGI utilizes something called RLE compression, which is run length encoding. And what that does is it looks at the entire image that you're rendering, and if you've got big areas of similar color, so for example, if you were going to compress this down, all these areas of similar color get heavily compressed, and all the detail areas, like this red X, don't get compression. So when you end up with a 2K file, for example, the entire thing isn't going to be 14 megs or 15 megs. If you're rendering an image sequence, if you get to a part of the sequence where you've got a full screen or a full frame image, then that will be larger than if the full entire frame isn't filled up with an image. So it's just a much more efficient way to save files. And that's really important because in today's rendering world, you end up rendering many, many layers and high bit rate or bit depths, and your storage can become kind of an issue if you don't use an intelligent codec. So that's the first thing, is the name.number.extension, and the SGI codec is the one that I choose to use. Your start and your end frames, if you're going to be rendering through batch mode, that's important. Otherwise, if you're rendering through command line or using a queuing software, you'll set all that stuff up outside. So we can leave it at 1 through 10. And the other one that's important to you is frame padding, and I'm just going to set it to 4. Again, 4 is a pretty standard convention, 4 or 5, and it just makes it easier to figure out how or the order of your frames. So, and then we'll talk about some custom resolution stuff here in just a second. So the thing I want to show you about the file name prefix is that there's a few conventions that you can use in here that are going to help dramatically, because that's one of the problems you run into with any renderer. When you start generating massive amounts of data, management becomes a big issue, and especially if you're using render layers, which we'll get into. Maybe you're rendering a spec, diffuse, occlusion, color alpha, z depth, motion vector, and you've got a 500 frame sequence, and you can end up with literally thousands of frames floating out in a directory, and you can spend the better part of your morning just collecting the last night's renders. And so by utilizing a little bit of command line stuff up here, you can dramatically simplify that process for you. So the first thing that I'm going to do is tell it that I want it to save into directories based on the scene name. So you do this by typing in %s. So it's going to tell it to create a directory and the S stands for scene, that's based on the scene file. And then I'm going to put a /, and I'm going to put %l. And this would be relevant if we were using render layers. So it's going to create a directory structure that is based after the scene. So first it creates the scene name directory, and then it creates the layer name directory. And then from there, I can tell it to name it something. So I can put, again, %scene, and this time I'm going to use an underscore, and then I'm going to put %layer. And by doing that, once I hit tab, you can see exactly what happens here. The file name is going to be called untitled because I haven't saved the scene out as anything yet. Master layer, because that is the default render layer before you create one. And then the file itself is going to be called untitled_master layer. Now, if you wanted to have it also utilize camera information, for example, because a lot of times maybe you'll be covering the scene through multiple cameras, so I'm going to have it put first the %scene and then /, and then I'm going to do another one that's %camera /, and then it's going to do %layer, so it'll create the layers that are relevant to that camera, and then /, and then %scene. Then I'm going to put another %camera underscore. Oops, go back one, underscore. And now it's going to create a folder for the scene, create a folder for the camera, create a folder for the layer. And so all of your file management is being done for you right here. So you hit the render button and it's automatically going to organize everything. And that's a tremendous time saving for you. So the other things in here that we want to pay attention to, advanced image naming, we've kind of taken care of that up here. The image file size, obviously this is really important because you'll be rendering out for a specific requirement, and we'll talk about that. And then any pre-mel or post-mel things that you want to set up. And the last thing that I would normally do is turn off default light, because we'll get into situations where we're using indirect illumination through Final Gather, for example, and we'll use an IBL node, an image-based light node. And an image-based light node is a light source, but it's not seen by Maya as being a light. So you'll create this IBL node, you'll be looking for the indirect diffusion or lighting, and you'll be getting a bright light coming from somewhere, and it's just because of this default light. So the best way to avoid having a problem with it is just to turn it off. Now, as far as image size is concerned, there's a whole handful of standard image sizes that everybody uses, and a lot of that stuff is covered up in is available through the Maya standard stuff. But in my particular workflow, we end up using a lot of these formats, whether they're HD formats or they're television resolution that's non-square pixel, or it's a square pixel television resolution. A lot of times when we work on film stuff, I want to work on the same aspect ratio as a Super 35 plate, but I don't want to render the entire thing out, so I have a resolution that's just half of that. And of course, all of these things can be typed in here. I can type in 1024/768 and tell it that I want it to have a square pixel aspect because I'm working on film. But it just becomes redundant because every time that I set the scene up, I want to be working at Super 35 half, for example. So the obvious thing would be to create your own presets. And the way that you do that is to go into your wherever the scripts for your Maya reside. So for example, mine are inside of Documents and Settings, Administrator, and then My Documents, Maya, and then Scripts. And specifically, the MEL script that you're looking for in here is User Image Formats. So I'm just going to right-click on that and open it up into WordPad, or it could be any text editor that you've got. And what you're looking for is this stuff here. I'm going to include this all on the DVD, so you don't have to try to write it down right now. You can just copy it and paste it into your own user settings. But if you're going to enter in your own settings, it's just really important that you follow this syntax exactly. Otherwise, if you forget a quotation or something, it won't work. So it's probably best to just copy and paste and that'll cover you there. But so what you have here is first the name of whatever the format is going to be, and then the specifications of it. And you'll notice that these first two are pretty obvious, 2048 by 1556, but then this last number is a little bit ambiguous. And what that is the device aspect ratio. So the way to figure out your initial render settings or your initial resolutions is to come in here and configure it through here, and then it'll give you the device aspect, and then you can plug it into your settings. So pretty much there's two pixel aspects. If you're working with either broadcast or film, there's two pixel aspects you're going to work with. If it's in film, it's going to be a square pixel, which is 1, and if it's broadcast, then it's going to be a non-square pixel, which is going to be 0.9. So those are kind of the two standard ones that you're going to work at. Now, outside of this, it's a matter of figuring out what your resolution should be. So let's say that you're working on broadcast DV, and you're going to be rendering a plate out. So I'm going to do 720 by 480, and my pixel aspect ratio is going to be 0.9. So now, my 720, 480, and my 0.9 pixel aspect ratio derives a device aspect ratio of 1.35. So I can take this 1.35 and go back into my user image formats and plug that in the 1.35 over here. Okay, so this is relevant to everything that you create. If you're doing HD and you're doing 1920 by 1080, okay, and we know that we have a device or a pixel aspect of 1.0 because HD is square pixel, then my device aspect is going to be 1.778. All right, and so then you can come back over here, and your device aspect is 1.778. And I guess the other thing you could do if you're really paranoid is take the known aspect ratios and just use a calculator and divide them. So HD is 16 by 9. If you divide 16 by 9, you'll come up with 1.778, and that would be a way to sort of round robin double check yourself. So once you've done that, you can save it out, restart Maya, and then whatever you've entered in here will show up in here. And again, just make sure that you follow the syntax exactly, because if you, for example, forget a comma, then it's just going to kind of blank this whole thing out and nothing will show up. So that's the way that I tend to set up this tab. So again, this is simply to help you organize the files as they're rendered, because you're going to be generating a lot of files using render layers. The frame and animation extension, I just always name.number.extension. I save as SGI because of the RLE compression. Frame padding, I always set to 4 frames or to 4 numbers. Renderable cameras, this is all going to be dependent on how your scene is set up. Right now we have our 1 camera in there, and then whatever your image size is going to be. And if you choose to create your custom user image or custom user image formats, then those will show up in here as well.